Welcome to Untold Stories of Freddie Mercury. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And now, let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Wembley Arena as roadies rushed through the narrow corridors, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls lined with cables and equipment cases. It was November 1986, and Queen had just delivered another electrifying performance to a sold-out crowd of 72,000 fans. The energy from the stage still pulsed through the building's bones, but backstage, a different kind of electricity was building. Freddie Mercury sat in his dressing room, still wearing his iconic white tank top and jeans, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath from the 2-hour marathon performance. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and his dark hair clung to his scalp in damp curls. The adrenaline from commanding the massive audience was slowly giving way to the familiar post-show exhaustion that settled into his muscles like a heavy blanket. Outside his door, the usual chaos of a Queen concert aftermath was unfolding. Security guards maintained their positions, while crew members began the massive undertaking of breaking down the elaborate stage setup. The sound of equipment being wheeled across concrete floors mixed with the distant hum of fans still lingering in the arena, hoping for one last glimpse of their heroes. But something unusual was happening near the backstage entrance. A young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, had somehow managed to slip past the initial security checkpoint. She wasn't like the typical fans who screamed and reached desperately for autographs. This girl moved with purpose, clutching a worn envelope against her chest as if it contained her most precious possession. Her name was Sarah, and she had traveled over 300 miles from a small town in northern England. She wore a simple Queen t-shirt that had seen better days, and her jeans were frayed at the edges. But her eyes held a determination that caught the attention of Jim Beach, Queen's manager, who was making his rounds through the backstage area. The security team had noticed her too. She wasn't causing a disturbance or trying to force her way deeper into the restricted areas. Instead, she simply stood there, waiting with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose. When approached by security, she had quietly explained that she needed to speak with Freddie Mercury about something important. Not for an autograph, not for a photo, but for help. The word help had an unusual effect on the hardened security staff. In their years of working concerts, they had heard every possible excuse from fans trying to get closer to the stars. But something in this young woman's voice, something in the way she held that envelope, made them pause. Roger Taylor emerged from his own dressing room, his blonde hair still damp with perspiration, and noticed the commotion. He had seen thousands of fans over the years, but this situation felt different. The girl wasn't hysterical or demanding. She simply stood there with quiet dignity, as if she understood the gravity of whatever had brought her to this moment. Brian May appeared moments later, his distinctive curls catching the harsh fluorescent lighting of the corridor. He exchanged glances with Roger, both men sensing that something significant was unfolding. They had learned to trust their instincts about people over the years of touring, and their instincts were telling them that this wasn't an ordinary fan encounter. The backstage area seemed to hold its breath as word spread quietly among the crew. A fan was asking for help, not fame or glory, but genuine assistance with something that had driven her to travel hundreds of miles and wait patiently in the rain-soaked London night. The news of the young woman's presence reached Freddie's dressing room through whispered conversations between crew members. Jim Beach stood outside the door, weighing his options carefully. In his years of managing Queen, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between genuine situations and elaborate fan schemes. Something about this particular case made him hesitate before dismissing it outright. Inside the dressing room, Freddie was going through his usual post-show ritual. He had removed his stage clothes and wrapped himself in a silk robe, the fabric clinging to his still warm skin. A towel draped around his neck caught the last drops of perspiration as he sipped from a glass of champagne, letting the bubbles soothe his throat after 2 hours of powerful vocals that had shaken the very foundations of Wembley Arena. The mirror in front of him reflected a man who had just given everything he had to 72,000 people. His eyes, though tired, still held the spark that had ignited the crowd just minutes earlier. But there was something else there too, a restlessness that always followed the incredible high of performance, a need to channel the remaining energy into something meaningful. Peter Freestone, Freddie's personal assistant, entered quietly and began organizing the scattered items around the room. He had worked with Freddie long enough to read his moods like sheet music, and tonight he sensed an unusual openness in the singer's demeanor. The performance had been particularly powerful, one of those magical nights when everything aligned perfectly between artist and audience. Meanwhile, in the corridor, Sarah continued her patient vigil. The envelope in her hands had become slightly crumpled from her nervous grip, but she held it, as if it contained the most important words ever written. Security guards had positioned themselves nearby, not threatening but watchful, unsure how to handle a situation that fell outside their usual protocols. The young woman's story had begun to circulate among the crew in hushed tones. She had apparently explained to the initial security checkpoint that she wasn't seeking an autograph or a meeting for personal gratification. Instead, she carried a letter that detailed a situation requiring help. Real, tangible assistance that only someone with Freddie's resources and influence might be able to provide. Brian May found himself drawn back to the corridor, his curiosity piqued by the unusual circumstances. He had always been the most analytical member of Queen, the one who approached situations with scientific precision, but even his logical mind couldn't categorize this encounter into any familiar pattern. The girl's composure was remarkable for someone so young, especially given the intimidating environment of a major concert venue's backstage area. Roger Taylor joined Brian in the hallway, both men now openly observing the situation. They had witnessed Freddie's legendary generosity countless times over the years, his spontaneous gifts to friends, his support for various causes, his genuine care for people who touched his life. But they had also seen him become increasingly protective of his privacy, as Queen's fame had grown to astronomical proportions. The crew members who had been working with Queen for years began to share their own observations. This wasn't the behavior of a typical fan trying to manufacture a meeting with a rock star. The girl's body language spoke of genuine need rather than starstruck enthusiasm. She wasn't taking photos of the backstage area or trying to collect souvenirs. Her entire focus remained fixed on that envelope and the hope that its contents might somehow reach Freddie Mercury. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the backstage area began to shift. What had started as a routine security matter was evolving into something that demanded a different kind of attention. The usual post-concert energy was being redirected toward this unexpected human drama unfolding in their midst. Jim Beach made his decision. He approached Freddie's dressing room door with the measured steps of a man who had learned to navigate the complex world of rock stardom while preserving the humanity of the artists he represented. Jim Beach knocked softly on Freddie's dressing room door, a gesture that had become second nature after years of managing the delicate balance between protecting his artist and allowing meaningful human connections. The sound was barely audible above the distant rumble of equipment being moved through the arena's corridors, but Freddie's acute hearing, sharpened by years of studio work, caught it immediately. When Jim entered, he found Freddie seated at his makeup table, carefully removing the remnants of stage cosmetics with practiced efficiency. The ritual of transformation from Freddie Mercury, the performer, back to Farrokh Bulsara, the man was always a gradual process, one that required both physical and emotional adjustment. Tonight, however, something in Jim's expression suggested that the transition might be interrupted. The manager's face carried the weight of a decision that could go either way. He had spent years learning to read situations, to distinguish between the countless requests that flooded their world daily and the rare moments that demanded genuine consideration. His instincts, honed through decades in the music industry, were telling him that the young woman in the corridor represented something different. Freddie's reflection in the mirror showed a man whose curiosity had been piqued. The post-performance energy, that usually left him restless and seeking distraction, had found a new focus. He had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something important was happening around him, a quality that had served him well both on stage and in life. Peter Freestone continued his quiet work in the background, organizing Freddie's belongings with the efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times. But even he had noticed the unusual tension in the air tonight, the sense that the normal post-concert routine was being disrupted by something unexpected and potentially significant. Outside in the corridor, Sarah's presence had begun to affect the entire backstage atmosphere. Crew members who had worked hundreds of concerts found themselves stealing glances at the young woman who waited with such remarkable composure. Her patience was extraordinary, especially considering the intimidating environment of a major rock venue's restricted areas. The envelope in her hands had become the focal point of everyone's attention, though she seemed unaware of the scrutiny. Whatever it contained had driven her to make an incredible journey, to somehow navigate past multiple layers of security, and to wait in the hope that her message might reach one of the world's most famous performers. Brian May and Roger Taylor had positioned themselves where they could observe the situation without interfering. Both men had developed deep respect for Freddie's judgment over the years, but they also felt a protective instinct toward their friend and bandmate. The music industry had taught them to be cautious about unexpected encounters, yet something about this particular situation felt genuine. The security team remained professional, but increasingly uncertain about how to proceed. Their training had prepared them for aggressive fans, for people seeking unauthorized access for personal gain, for the countless schemes that surrounded major rock concerts. But this quiet young woman with her patient dignity and mysterious envelope didn't fit any of their established protocols. Word of the situation had begun to spread among the arena staff as well. Janitors paused in their work, sound technicians found excuses to linger in the area, and even some of the catering staff had become aware that something unusual was happening. The collective attention of dozens of people was gradually focusing on this unexpected human drama. Freddie's decision-making process was always intuitive rather than analytical. He had built his career on trusting his instincts, on following impulses that others might dismiss as risky or unconventional. Tonight, those same instincts were stirring, suggesting that whatever had brought this young woman to his backstage door might be worth his attention. The moment hung suspended in the fluorescent-lit corridor, pregnant with possibility, and weighted with the understanding that some encounters have the power to change everything that follows. The decision crystallized in Freddie's mind with the sudden clarity that had guided his most important life choices. He rose from his makeup chair, the silk robe flowing around him as he moved with the fluid grace that characterized both his stage presence and his private moments. The exhaustion from the performance seemed to evaporate, replaced by a focused energy that Jim Beach recognized as Freddie's response to genuine human need. Without hesitation, Freddie indicated that he wanted to meet the young woman. Jim nodded, understanding that this wasn't a casual decision, but rather the result of Freddie's remarkable ability to sense when someone required his help. Over the years, Jim had witnessed countless examples of Freddie's generosity, but he had also learned to trust the singer's instincts about people and situations. The news that Freddie had agreed to the meeting rippled through the backstage area like electricity. Crew members who had been pretending to focus on their tasks now openly watched as preparations were made for this unprecedented encounter. The usual post-concert protocols were quietly adjusted to accommodate what everyone sensed was becoming a significant moment. Sarah felt the shift in atmosphere before anyone told her what was happening. The quality of attention around her had changed, becoming more focused and purposeful. Security guards who had been maintaining professional distance now positioned themselves with the careful precision of people preparing for something important. Her grip on the envelope tightened involuntarily as she realized that her patient vigil might actually be rewarded. Brian May and Roger Taylor exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their shared history with Freddie. They had seen him make spontaneous decisions that others might consider risky, but they had also witnessed the positive outcomes that often resulted from his willingness to trust his instincts about people. Tonight felt like one of those moments when Freddie's natural empathy was about to manifest in action. The backstage area underwent a subtle transformation as word spread that Freddie Mercury was coming out to meet a fan. But this wasn't the usual celebrity appearance that might happen after a concert. The atmosphere carried a weight of anticipation that suggested something more meaningful was about to unfold. Even the most experienced crew members, who had seen everything the rock and roll world had to offer, found themselves drawn to witness this encounter. Peter Freestone made final adjustments to Freddie's appearance, ensuring that he looked presentable while maintaining the casual accessibility that would put the young woman at ease. The balance between Freddie Mercury, the global superstar, and Farrokh, the compassionate human being, was always delicate, but tonight it seemed particularly important to get it right. Sarah's journey to this moment had required extraordinary determination. The 300-mile trip from her small northern English town, the navigation through London's complex transportation system, the challenge of reaching Wembley Arena and somehow gaining access to the backstage area. Each step had demanded courage that she hadn't known she possessed. Now, as she sensed that her goal might actually be achieved, the magnitude of what she was attempting began to settle over her. The envelope in her hands contained more than words on paper. It represented hope in its purest form, the belief that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when human compassion intersects with genuine need. Whatever circumstances had driven her to seek Freddie Mercury's help had been serious enough to motivate this incredible journey, and now she stood on the threshold of discovering whether her faith in his legendary kindness was justified. The corridor seemed to hold its collective breath as the final preparations were made. Lighting technicians adjusted their equipment to ensure proper visibility. Security personnel positioned themselves to maintain privacy while allowing the meeting to proceed, and everyone involved understood that they were about to witness something that would be remembered long after the concert itself had faded from memory. The stage was set for an encounter that would demonstrate the power of human connection to transcend the barriers that typically separate performers from their audience. Freddie emerged from his dressing room with the quiet confidence that had made him one of the world's most compelling performers. He had changed into a simple black shirt and jeans, choosing comfort and approachability over the elaborate costumes that defined his stage persona. His hair, still slightly damp from the performance, caught the harsh backstage lighting as he moved through the corridor with purposeful steps. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The larger-than-life figure who had commanded Wembley Arena just an hour earlier had given way to a man whose presence, while still magnetic, carried an entirely different energy. This was Freddie in his most authentic form, curious, compassionate, and genuinely interested in connecting with another human being who had sought his help. Sarah saw him approaching and felt her heart rate accelerate dramatically. The reality of standing face-to-face with Freddie Mercury was overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus on the reason for her presence. The envelope in her hands seemed to grow heavier as the moment she had traveled so far to create finally arrived. Her composure, which had impressed everyone who had observed her patient wait, now faced its ultimate test. The crew members who had gathered to witness this encounter found themselves holding their breath. Many of them had worked with major artists for years, but there was something uniquely powerful about watching Freddie Mercury approach a fan with such genuine openness. His reputation for kindness was well established within the industry, but seeing it manifest in real time never failed to move even the most jaded professionals. Brian May and Roger Taylor positioned themselves where they could observe without intruding. Their protective instincts toward their bandmate were balanced by their respect for his judgment and their curiosity about what had motivated this young woman's extraordinary journey. The envelope she carried had become a symbol of hope and mystery that had captured everyone's attention. As Freddie drew closer, Sarah's nervousness became more apparent, but she maintained the dignity that had characterized her entire presence in the backstage area. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the envelope, but her eyes remained steady and focused. Whatever had brought her to this moment had required tremendous courage, and she was determined not to waste the opportunity she had fought so hard to create. The backstage lighting cast dramatic shadows across the scene, creating an almost cinematic quality to the encounter. The industrial setting of concrete walls and equipment cases provided a stark contrast to the human drama unfolding within it. This was rock and roll stripped of its glamour, reduced to its essential element, the connection between artist and audience. Jim Beach watched from a respectful distance, ready to intervene if necessary, but sensing that his protection wouldn't be needed. His years of experience had taught him to recognize genuine situations, and everything about this encounter felt authentic. The young woman's patient wait, her respectful demeanor, and the mysterious envelope all suggested that something meaningful was about to unfold. The arena around them continued its post-concert transformation. Equipment was being loaded onto trucks, the stage was being dismantled piece by piece, and the massive venue was slowly returning to its dormant state. But in this small section of corridor, time seemed suspended as two people prepared to connect across the vast divide that typically separated rock stars from their fans. Freddie's approach was unhurried but purposeful. He had learned over the years that genuine human encounters couldn't be rushed. that meaningful connections required patience and authentic presence. Tonight, he was prepared to give both to a young woman whose determination had already impressed everyone who had witnessed her vigil. When Freddie reached Sarah, the entire backstage area seemed to fall into a reverent silence. The usual sounds of post-concert activity, the rolling of equipment cases, the shouting of instructions, the general chaos of breakdown, all faded into background whispers, as everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the most hardened crew members, who had seen countless celebrity encounters, found themselves moved by the genuine humanity radiating from this moment. Sarah's hands shook as she extended the envelope toward Freddie, her eyes glistening with unshed tears that spoke of months, perhaps years, of carrying whatever burden had brought her to this point. The paper was worn from handling, suggesting it had been written and rewritten, carried and reconsidered countless times before she had found the courage to make this incredible journey to London. Freddie accepted the envelope with the same gentle reverence he might show a precious artifact. His fingers, still adorned with the rings that had become part of his iconic image, handled the simple paper as if it contained the most important words he would ever read. The weight of responsibility that came with his fame had never felt more tangible than in this moment, when someone's hope rested literally in his hands. The envelope bore no elaborate decoration, no fancy stationery that might suggest wealth or privilege. It was simply white paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, with Sarah's careful handwriting spelling out his name in blue ink. The simplicity of it somehow made the gesture more powerful, more authentic than any elaborate presentation could have achieved. As Freddie carefully opened the envelope, Sarah stepped back slightly, giving him space to read while maintaining the respectful distance that had characterized her entire approach to this encounter. Her posture spoke of someone who understood the magnitude of what she was asking, who recognized that she was requesting help from one of the world's most famous people for something deeply personal and important. The letter inside was written on matching paper, filled with the same careful handwriting that had adorned the envelope. As Freddie's eyes moved across the lines, his expression began to change. The casual interest that had brought him out of his dressing room transformed into something deeper, more focused. Whatever Sarah had written was clearly having a profound impact on the man who had just electrified 72,000 people with his performance. Brian May and Roger Taylor watched their friend's face intently, reading the subtle changes in his expression that years of collaboration had taught them to interpret. They could see that the letter was affecting Freddie deeply, that whatever request or story it contained was resonating with the compassionate core that drove so many of his actions, both public and private. The crew members who had gathered to witness this encounter found themselves emotionally invested in its outcome. Sarah's patient dignity, combined with Freddie's obvious engagement with her letter, had created an atmosphere of anticipation that transcended the usual boundaries between performer and audience. This was no longer about celebrity and fan. It had become about human beings connecting across circumstances that might otherwise keep them forever separated. Jim Beach observed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had managed countless interactions between Queen and their public. But even his extensive experience hadn't prepared him for the emotional weight of this particular encounter. The authenticity of the moment was undeniable, and he found himself hoping that whatever Sarah needed was something Freddie could provide. As Freddie continued reading, the backstage area remained suspended in respectful silence. The letter appeared to be several pages long, and with each paragraph, his engagement seemed to deepen. His free hand occasionally moved to his chest, a gesture that those who knew him well recognized as a sign that something was touching him profoundly. The industrial setting of the backstage area had been transformed into something almost sacred by the power of human connection. This was rock and roll at its most essential level, not about spectacle or performance, but about the fundamental human need to reach out and help one another. When Freddie finished reading the letter, he carefully folded it and held it against his chest for a long moment. His eyes closed as he processed what he had just learned. The silence in the corridor had become profound, broken only by the distant sounds of the arena's transformation back to its empty state. Everyone present could see that whatever Sarah had shared had moved him deeply, touching something fundamental in his character that transcended his celebrity status. The letter had revealed a story of genuine hardship and need. Sarah's younger brother, only 16 years old, was battling a rare form of leukemia that required specialized treatment available only at a private clinic in Switzerland. Her family had exhausted their savings, sold everything they owned, and still fell desperately short of the funds needed for the treatment that could save his life. Traditional fundraising efforts in their small northern town had helped, but the astronomical costs of the specialized care remained beyond their reach. What had driven Sarah to seek Freddie's help wasn't just the financial need, though that was overwhelming. Her brother was a devoted Queen fan whose love for the band's music had sustained him through months of painful treatments. During his darkest moments in the hospital, he would listen to Queen's songs on repeat, finding strength in Freddie's powerful voice and the band's anthemic messages of perseverance and triumph. The young man had never asked his sister to contact Freddie Mercury. In fact, he had no idea that Sarah had undertaken this desperate journey to London. She had acted entirely on her own, driven by a sister's love and the belief that sometimes miracles happen when human compassion meets genuine need. The letter detailed not just the medical situation, but also her brother's character, his kindness, his determination to fight, and his unwavering faith that somehow everything would work out. Freddie's response was immediate and decisive. Without hesitation, he indicated to Jim Beach that he wanted to help, that whatever resources were needed should be made available. The speed of his decision surprised no one who truly knew him, but the magnitude of his commitment took even his closest associates by surprise. This wasn't just about writing a check. Freddie was prepared to become personally involved in ensuring that Sarah's brother received the treatment he needed. The transformation in the backstage atmosphere was palpable. What had begun as curiosity about an unusual fan encounter had evolved into something that would be remembered by everyone present as a defining moment in their understanding of what it meant to use fame and fortune for genuinely meaningful purposes. Crew members who had worked hundreds of concerts found themselves wiping away tears as they witnessed compassion in its purest form. Sarah's reaction was overwhelming. The relief and gratitude that flooded through her were visible to everyone watching, but she maintained the dignity that had characterized her entire presence. She had gambled everything on the belief that Freddie Mercury's reputation for kindness was genuine, and that faith was being rewarded beyond her wildest hopes. Brian May and Roger Taylor exchanged looks that spoke volumes about their pride in their friend and bandmate. They had always known that Freddie's generosity was legendary, but seeing it manifest in such a direct and immediate way reinforced their understanding of the man behind the performer. This was why they had chosen to spend their careers creating music with him, not just for his talent, but for his fundamental humanity. The practical arrangements began immediately. Jim Beach started making phone calls to set up the financial transfers and coordinate with the Swiss clinic. Peter Freestone began organizing the logistics that would ensure Sarah's brother could begin treatment as soon as possible. The entire Queen organization mobilized with the efficiency that had made them one of the world's most successful bands, but now that efficiency was being directed towards saving a life. 3 months later, a different kind of letter arrived at Queen's management office. This one bore a Swiss postmark and was written in the same careful handwriting that had first captured Freddie's attention that November night at Wembley. Inside was a photograph of a young man standing in a hospital garden, his face thin but smiling, his eyes bright with the unmistakable glow of someone who had been given a second chance at life. Sarah's brother had not only survived the treatment, but was responding better than doctors had dared to hope. The specialized therapy that had seemed impossibly out of reach just months earlier had worked with remarkable effectiveness. The photograph showed him wearing a Queen t-shirt, his arm raised in a gesture that perfectly mimicked Freddie's iconic pose from the Live Aid performance. Attached to the photo was a note explaining that he was planning to attend Queen's next London concert, not as a patient fighting for his life, but as a healthy young man celebrating his recovery. The impact of that backstage encounter had rippled far beyond the immediate medical crisis. Word of Freddie's generosity had spread quietly through the music industry, inspiring other artists to look for ways to use their platforms for meaningful help. The story had been kept private at Freddie's insistence, but those who knew about it found themselves changed by witnessing such direct and effective compassion. For the crew members who had been present that night, the memory had become a touchstone for understanding what their work in the music industry could really mean. They had seen countless performances, witnessed spectacular shows, and been part of creating magical moments for millions of fans. But nothing had affected them quite like watching Freddie Mercury read a letter from a desperate sister and immediately commit to saving her brother's life. Jim Beach had handled many unusual requests during his years managing Queen, but the efficiency with which Freddie's decision had been implemented remained one of his proudest professional achievements. The financial arrangements had been completed within days, the medical transfers had been coordinated seamlessly, and the entire process had been handled with the discretion that protected both the family's privacy and Freddie's desire to help without seeking publicity. Brian May and Roger Taylor had incorporated the experience into their own understanding of what it meant to be successful musicians. The technical skills, the creative collaboration, and the business acumen were all important, but the real measure of their achievement was moments like these, when their success could be transformed into genuine help for people who needed it most. The backstage area at Wembley had returned to its normal function, hosting countless other concerts and events. But for those who had been present that November night, the corridor where Freddie had met Sarah would always carry a special significance. It had become a place where the abstract concept of using fame for good had been transformed into concrete action with life-changing results. Freddie himself rarely spoke about the incident, but those closest to him noticed subtle changes in how he approached his interactions with fans and requests for help. The experience had reinforced his belief that genuine human connection could transcend any barrier, that sometimes the most important performances happened not on stage, but in quiet moments when one person reached out to help another. Years later, when music historians would analyze Freddie Mercury's legacy, they would focus primarily on his artistic achievements, his revolutionary performances, and his influence on popular culture. But for a small group of people who had been present in a backstage corridor one November night, his greatest performance had nothing to do with music and everything to do with the simple act of reading a letter and choosing to help when help was desperately needed. The story had become legend among those who witnessed it, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments in rock and roll happen not under spotlights, but in the quiet spaces where human compassion meets genuine need. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming emotional and inspiring tales about Freddie's life and legacy. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and often your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.